Hello everybody, welcome. I'm Sergio Hernandez. I'll be your facilitator for this series of videos on the DD15. In this particular segment, we'll be doing a familiarization of the DD15. But first of all, let's get a little bit of background on it. DD15 is the latest inception from Detroit Diesel, and it is slated to replace the 60 series. It is actually a third less noise and vibration from the 60 series. It is 3,000 pounds of gross weight, and it is also considered their global engine. The way they boast that is because 90% of the parts across the globe are consistent with each other, which means if you're working on an engine here in the United States or in Asia or in Australia, 90% of the components are interchangeable, which is a first in the industry. And the other is that a lot of the components are made in diverse areas and countries. Like for instance, the block is made in South Africa. And one of the newest components that they have added to this engine is the APT, the axial power turbine. And that is something that we'll be covering here in just a little bit. So let's go ahead and get started, and let's start covering these sections of this engine so that we can get familiarized with it. So let's start with the front. Starting here at the front, we're looking here at the two sets of pulleys. The back one is a harmonic balancer, and the front one's an adapter pulley. The back one is where your serpentine belt runs your water pump, alternator, and air conditioner. Your front one runs your fan assembly. Now, if we look at the water pump is part of your coolant module. So let's go ahead and take a look at the coolant module and define what it's made of and what its components are. Let's start with the oil coolant module right here. This whole section right here has several components in it. So let's start. Right here we have the fuel water coalescer or coolant filter. This is where you would service it, you would remove it and replace it. Right behind it, right here, we have the engine oil filter. Again, remove it, replace it, service it. Right next to it, right here, we have our oil filler cap and oil filler neck. And just below that, right here, we have the thermostat housing. This is a one-piece unit. This is the cover and the thermostat in one piece. You replace this cover, you replace the thermostat. Just below it, we have a 31-pin connector. That 31-pin connector communicates with the MCM, the motor control module, and the CPC, Common Powertrain Controller. And that's how it communicates with the cab of the vehicle and all other electronic components and modules. Let's step back a little bit further and we look at this here, and we have our ram air inlet. If we take this cap off and we look in here, we actually have a butterfly valve or throttle valve in there. And what happens is it'll open and close and is controlled by the MCM. That is primarily used during a regeneration process, or regen. Is part of the DPF, diesel particulate filtration system. That we'll talk in another segment, but that is the primary reason for that. Right here we have the air grid heater. It's a 12-volt system derived from the vehicle, and it produces 3.5 kilowatts to warm up the air, and it's controlled by the MCM, and it comes on at 4 degrees Fahrenheit. So now let's go back and continue going through these components. Right here we have our cam housing. Our cam housing has drilled oil passages in order to feed the cam gears, the rockers, and the Jake brakes. Now, just below it here, we have two electrical connectors. And if you'll notice, one's towards the front of the engine and one's towards the back. That's because this connector controls the injectors 1, 2, and 3, and also your front Jakes. Back one controls 4, 5, and 6, and your back Jakes. Obviously, the signal comes from your MCM. Moving down here, we have the fuel filter module, we have the coalescer or fuel water separator, final filter, the pre-filter, and we have the hand or manual priming pump when you run out of fuel or you've replaced the filter. Just below that, we come down here and we have the WIF, or water and fuel sensor. There's two small LEDs. This one is either red or orange, and this one over here where it says OK will turn green. Just below that, we have the MCM or motor control module. Again, this is the brain for the engine, or commonly known as the ECM. We come up here and we have the high pressure pump. Attached to the back of the high pressure pump, we have on top the quantity control valve. And just below that, we have the gear pump or low pressure pump. That low pressure pump creates a vacuum and basically sucks the fuel from the tank through the system into itself. Then once it leaves, now it's under pressure. Below that, we have the air compressor, single piston air compressor. Now, back here we have a cover on this particular engine. Normally this cover would be off and the power steering pump would be attached to it. They do have an option for a 2-piston air compressor, and if that were to be the case, the power steering pump would be mounted to the accessory drive. Now, we come up here and we have the doser block. Doser block feeds our doser valve. It is part of the after treatment system, which we will cover in another segment. Back here we have our flywheel cover. Now, the flywheel cover is not just the flywheel cover. It actually separates the flywheel from the accessory gear drive or gear trains. Most engines will have it in the front. This particular engine has it in the back. So it's not just a flywheel housing. It also is a cover for the accessory drive. There's 5 idler gears plus the gear that we're looking at here for the compressor, the pump, and on the other side we also have the axial power turbine. So let's go ahead and move to the right side of the engine as we sit on it and take a look at the other components that are on the other side that we need to know and identify for this familiarization. Now that we're on the right-hand side of the engine or the passenger side, we're looking and we're continuing with the theme. We finished off on the back section of the left-hand side. So now back here we have the exhaust tube. Now this exhaust tube will feed obviously exhaust gases, and they'll be directed to the DOC or the DPF, which is diesel particulate filtration system, or the diesel oxidation catalyst. Attached to that we have the doser valve, and obviously it's also part of the after treatment. The doser valve actually controls the amount of fuel that is shot into the system and into the exhaust to get it to burn clean. And of course it's controlled by the doser block. Doser block will feed the fuel to it. Now we're looking here, and we're right here in this section that you see right here. This is your APT or axial power turbine. And basically what it is doing, it is mounted after the turbocharger, and it takes the exhaust gases, of course, and it spins. But over here you have a fluid coupler. What it is basically, it's like a miniature torque converter, and at a certain speed it engages, and now it converts it from exhaust gas to mechanical, and there's a reduction gear which is attached to the accessory gear drive back here. Now, this component alone adds an extra 50 horsepower, which is technically, if you look at it, free, because it's using and recycling exhaust gases which would be vented out into the atmosphere. So let's go ahead and stand up and let's cover the rest of this side. Okay, now that we're starting at the top of the right-hand side of the engine, we're starting with the coolant collector. Obviously the namesake gives it what it does. But one of the most important features that it does have, it also provides coolant for the EGR cooler, or exhaust gas recirculation cooler. And its namesake says it all. It takes exhaust gases, which if you follow this, comes to this valve here. And now this valve opens and allows a certain amount of exhaust gas to come back in, get cooled down, and then at the other end it goes back into our intake system to get recirculated. Now, this particular valve is actuated by this actuator here, which is controlled by the MCM or motor control module. Underneath that, now we have our turbocharger. It's fixed displacement, it's not variable geometry, and of course it is right in front of the APT or axial power turbine. Now, let's take a look at the last component in this journey, and that's going to be our crankcase breather, which is down at the bottom. Okay, we're here with the crankcase breather. If you'll notice, there's a tube coming out of the block feeding right into our breather. What this is positive crankcase ventilation. In the old days, engines would have a tube or a hose just laying there, and you could see a smoke and sometimes moisture and oil dripping. Well, now with stringent EPA standards, now we have to get rid of those contaminants. And what this is inside is like a small miniature centrifuge, and it'll spin and it'll separate the oil and other particulates, and it'll bring them back into the crankcase, and the rest of the air will come out here. And that concludes our familiarization with the engine. I hope you really enjoyed it, and now you're ready to continue on with the rest of this series and learn more about the DD15. Thank you.